The Iron Haven gym was alive with energy. People pushed themselves on treadmills, lifted heavy weights, and engaged in intense fitness classes, their determination fueling the electrifying atmosphere. It was a regular afternoon, the kind where everyone was too focused on their own routines to pay much attention to anything else. That is, until the moment the gym doors swung open and someone unexpected walked in. At first, there was nothing extraordinary about him. Johnny Depp, dressed in a simple gray hoodie and black sweatpants, entered the gym with no fanfare, no flashing cameras, and no entourage trailing behind. He moved with quiet confidence, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. He wasn't looking to be noticed. He was simply there to train. Most of the people in the gym didn't even recognize him at first, too caught up in their own workouts to give a second glance to the man who had portrayed some of Hollywood's toughest action heroes. But one person noticed him almost immediately. Mike Carson. Mike was a well-known trainer at Iron Haven, and not just for his expertise. He had a big personality to match his muscular frame, and he had built a reputation for being the loudest, most dominant presence in the gym. With his carefully curated image of power, he thrived on being the center of attention. And more than anything, he enjoyed testing people, mocking them, putting them in their place, showing them that he was the strongest man in the room. The moment his eyes locked onto Vin, his smirk widened. To Mike, Vin wasn't a threat. He was an opportunity. Another guy who thought wearing a hoodie and looking tough was enough to make him strong. Mike had seen plenty of people like that before, guys who walked into the gym thinking they belonged, only to be put in their place by someone who truly lived and breathed fitness. To Mike, Vin was just another pretender. He leaned toward a group of his usual followers, chuckling. "Look at this guy," he said loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "Think he's here to lift, or just to pose for another movie poster?" A few people laughed, but some only glanced at Vin. Their curiosity piqued. Still stretching, Vin showed no reaction. That annoyed Mike, so he took a step closer, raising his voice so there was no way Vin could ignore him. "Hey man, you sure you know what you're doing? This isn't a movie set. This is a real gym. Takes more than looking tough to be strong." This time, the gym did quiet down. Conversations paused. Weights clanked to a stop. People turned their heads, sensing the tension in the air. Vin finally looked up. His gaze met Mike's calm, unwavering, unreadable. There was no irritation, no defensiveness, just a quiet certainty that made Mike's stomach tighten in a way he didn't quite understand. "I'm just here to work out," Vince said simply. Mike had expected a different response. He had been waiting for defensiveness for Vin to push back, to give him something to work with. But instead he got indifference. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. Mike's whole game relied on getting under people's skin, making them flustered, making them feel small so that he could feel big. And Vin would just brush him off like he was nothing. Mike clenched his jaw. "Well then," he said, forcing a smirk, "how about a little test? Let's see if Hollywood muscles can handle some real weight." The challenge was issued, and for the first time that day, Johnny Depp gave Mike his full attention. The Iron Haven gym in downtown Los Angeles was alive with energy. The sound of weights clanking against metal, treadmills whirring in unison, and voices exchanging workout tips filled the air. The gym had a reputation. It wasn't just a place to lift weights. It was a proving ground where only the toughest, most dedicated athletes thrived. This was where people came to push their limits, to test their endurance, and to build the kind of strength that demanded respect. Among the regulars was Mike Carson, a towering figure with bulging muscles and an even bigger ego. Mike was more than just a trainer. He was a self-proclaimed fitness guru, someone who lived for the attention and thrived on being the loudest voice in the room. To him, the gym wasn't just a workplace. It was his stage. He strutted around in expensive athletic gear. His arms always flexed just enough to showcase his biceps. He enjoyed belittling newcomers, making sarcastic remarks about their form, their strength, or sometimes just their choice of clothing. His audience, a small group of loyal gym-goers who fed off his arrogance, laughed along, entertained by his bravado. That afternoon, the gym doors swung open and in walked Johnny Depp. There was nothing flashy about his entrance. No cameras, no entourage, no air of celebrity. dressed in a plain gray hoodie and black sweatpants. He looked like any other guy stepping in for a workout. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the equipment and atmosphere. Most people didn't even recognize him at first, and that suited him just fine. He wasn't there to be noticed. He was there to train. Vin moved toward a quiet corner, rolling his shoulders as he prepared for a warm-up. He stretched, focusing on loosening his muscles, his movements smooth and deliberate. Mike, always looking for a target, spotted him almost immediately. Something about Vin's presence irked him. Maybe it was the way he carried himself. Too calm, too unbothered. He thrived on confrontation, on putting people in their place. And today, he decided Vin would be his next victim. With a smirk, he turned to the group of people nearby. "Check this guy out," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Think he's here to lift, or just pose for another movie poster?" The comment earned a few chuckles from his usual crowd, but some gym members only glanced at Vin with curiosity. Mike wasn't done. He took a step closer, crossing his arms over his chest. "Hey man," he called out, his voice laced with mockery. "You sure you know what you're doing? This isn't a movie set. This is real work." The gym grew quieter, conversations pausing as people tuned in. Vin, still focused on his warm-up, exhaled slowly and finally looked up. His eyes met Mike's expression, unreadable. There was no hostility, no irritation, just a calm gaze that seemed to weigh the situation carefully before he responded. "I'm just here to work out," Vin said simply. Mike raised an eyebrow. He had been expecting defensiveness, maybe even an argument. Instead, he got something worse. Indifference. Vin didn't see him as a threat, didn't feel the need to prove anything. And that made Mike bristle. He wasn't used to being ignored. His smirk returned, but now there was a hint of frustration behind it. "Well then," he scoffed, "how about a little test? Let's see if Hollywood muscles can handle some real weight." The challenge was issued, and for the first time that day, Johnny Depp gave Mike his full attention. Mike's smirk widened as he walked toward the dumbbell rack, his confidence undeterred despite the calm indifference in Johnny Depp's eyes. He grabbed a pair of heavy dumbbells, much heavier than what most people in the gym would comfortably pick for curls, and turned back toward Vin. "All right, movie star. Let's see what you've got. No stunt doubles here," he said, making sure his voice carried enough to draw the attention of everyone nearby. He placed the dumbbells down with a loud thud, crossing his arms, waiting for Vin to hesitate. Vin glanced at the weights for a brief moment, then reached down and picked them up without a word. His grip firm, his posture relaxed. He lifted them with precision, controlled, steady, flawless. His elbows stayed locked in place. His breathing was rhythmic, and each repetition was executed with the kind of discipline that only came from years of dedicated training. There was no struggle, no unnecessary movement, just the simple display of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. A few gym goers who had been watching closely exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. They had seen plenty of people lift weights before, but this was different. It wasn't just strength. It was efficiency. Mike, however, wasn't about to back down. "All right, not bad," he said, forcing another smirk. "But that's just one exercise. Strength isn't just about looking good with curls. It's about real power. Let's move on to something serious." He turned toward the squat rack, grabbing plates and stacking them onto the bar with exaggerated movements, ensuring everyone in the gym saw the sheer amount of weight being loaded. "Let's see how you handle some real weight," he added, stepping back with an expectant look. Vin didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, rolling his shoulders before positioning himself under the bar. His movements were fluid, natural, unshaken by the sheer mass he was about to lift. As he braced himself, the gym grew quiet again, people instinctively pausing their own workouts to watch. He took a deep breath, lowered himself smoothly, and then drove upward with absolute control. Down, upper, down, up. Every rep was perfect, his muscles engaging in harmony, his core tight, his breathing unbroken. By the time he racked the weight, the silence in the gym had been replaced by an undercurrent of murmured disbelief. "That's insane," someone whispered. "He made that look way too easy." Another added. Mike clenched his jaw, This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He had expected Vin to struggle, to fail, to give him something to exploit. Instead, he was watching effortless dominance. Mike took a step forward, trying to regain some control. "All right, tough guy," he said, louder this time. "Lifting weights is one thing, but power isn't just about lifting heavy. It's about how you use it." He pointed toward the heavy punching bag in the corner of the gym, swinging slightly from a previous session. "Let's see if you can actually do something with all that strength." He threw a few punches at the bag himself. Nothing impressive, just enough to make it move slightly. Then he turned back to Vin, arms crossed, waiting. Vin looked at the bag, his expression unreadable. Then, without saying a word, he stepped forward, positioned himself, and unleashed his first punch. The impact was immediate. The entire gym flinched as the bag lurched backward violently, the chain above groaning under the force. The sound of the hit echoed, reverberating through the room, followed by a sharp silence. Then, just as quickly, he struck again, a brutal, efficient series of punches, elbows, and a final devastating roundhouse kick that sent the bag swinging so wildly that it nearly ripped off its hook. A ripple of shock spread through the gym. This wasn't just raw power. This was precision, the kind of controlled force that only came from someone who had trained for years, who understood exactly how to channel every ounce of their strength with purpose. Mike's stomach twisted. He had spent years trying to project dominance, trying to prove that he was the strongest. But as he watched the punching bag sway from Vin's final strike, he realized something he wasn't ready to admit. He was outclassed. Still, he forced himself to keep going, desperation creeping into his voice. "All right, you've got power, but strength is also about endurance. Let's see how you handle the ropes." He gestured toward the battle ropes, hoping, praying that maybe this was where he could regain some ground. Mike picked up the thick, heavy ropes first, making a show of slamming them against the floor. His arms tensed, his face contorted with effort. After about 20 seconds, he dropped them, exhaling loudly, flashing a grin as if he had just set some kind of benchmark. "Let's see you keep up with that," he said smugly, stepping aside. Vin didn't hesitate. He picked up the ropes, squared his stance, and began. At first, it was a steady rhythm, his arms moving in powerful, controlled waves. But then, with a sudden burst of energy, he intensified his movements. The ropes thundered against the floor, shaking the ground. Beneath them, each strike landing with punishing force. The sheer speed and strength of his movements were overwhelming. His breathing remained even, his posture strong, his focus unshaken. A full minute passed, then another. Mike's confidence cracked. The gym was silent, except for the relentless whipping of the ropes against the ground. Sweat beat it on Vin's forehead, but he never slowed down, never lost control. By the time he finally let the ropes still, the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Mike, struggling to find a way out, let out a forced chuckle. "All right," he said, his voice weaker now. "That's impressive, but let's finish this with something that really shows strength. Deadlifts." He walked toward the barbell station, loading on an enormous amount of weight, so much that a few gym-goers shook their heads. "This is where we separate the real lifters from the posers," he added, though the bravado in his tone was faltering. Vin stepped forward, calm as ever. He positioned himself in front of the bar, adjusted his stance, then gripped the steel. He took a deep breath, focused, and pulled. The bar rose effortlessly. There was no shaking, no hesitation. He held the lift at the top, his muscles tight, but controlled, then lowered it with perfect precision. Then, without a word, he added even more weight. The gym gasped. Once again, he gripped the bar, and once again, he lifted. The moment he set the bar down, the room erupted. Some people clapped. Others just stood there, stunned into silence. But the message was clear. Johnny Depp was the real deal. Mike, standing off to the side, had nothing left. His usual bravado, his overconfidence, the arrogance that had defined him, all gone. Vin turned to Mike. His voice was steady, his gaze firm. "You wanted to see strength," he said. "Now let's see yours." Mike's stomach twisted. He looked at the weight Vin had just lifted and knew he couldn't match it. His hands fidgeted at his sides. His mind scrambled for an excuse, but there was none. The truth was plain for everyone to see. He had lost. And worst of all, Vin had never been competing with him in the first place. The gym was silent, waiting to see what Mike would do next. But for the first time in his life, Mike had no words. Mike stood frozen, his mind racing as the weight of the moment pressed down on him harder than any barbell ever could. His entire gym persona, his confidence, his dominance, his reputation had just been shattered in front of everyone. And worst of all, it hadn't even been because Johnny Depp had humiliated him. No, Vin had never taunted him, never rubbed anything in his face, never made a show of his strength. He had simply done the work. And in doing so, he had proven beyond a doubt that real strength didn't need validation. The gym had gone silent, ever eye now on Mike, waiting to see what he would do. There was no more laughter, no more smirks from his usual crowd. The people who had once egged him on, who had always enjoyed watching him belittle others, now stood uncomfortably still, as if realizing for the first time that maybe they had been rooting for the wrong guy. Mike's throat felt dry, his hands curled into fists at his sides. But he knew there was nothing left to say. He could walk away, pretend none of this had happened, maybe try to regain his dominance on another day. Or he could try to salvage what little pride he had left and attempt to lift the weight Vin had just conquered. But deep down, he already knew the answer. If he attempted it, he would fail. There was no point in pretending otherwise. Vin had lifted that bar like it was part of his routine. Mike would struggle, tremble, and ultimately he would lose, not just to Vin, but to himself. Vin, standing just a few feet away, didn't move. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't revel in his victory. Instead, he watched Mike with the same calm expression he had worn all day. An expression that held no judgment, no arrogance, just certainty. As if he had known, from the very beginning, exactly how this would play out. And maybe he had. Maybe Vin had walked into that gym, taken one look at Mike, and seen through the entire act, the bravado, the loud voice, the need to be the center of attention. It was all just a cover for something else. Mike swallowed hard. The silence was stretching too long now. He had to do something. With forced nonchalance, he let out a short laugh and shook his head. All right, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. You got me. He exhaled, glancing around at the people still watching before running a hand through his hair and taking a step back. Guess I needed that. His voice was quieter now, missing its usual sharp edge. He knew what he had to do, but damn, it wasn't easy. He turned to Vin, meeting his gaze. For a second, it felt like an eternity, but then he extended his hand. The gym collectively held its breath, then looked down at the outstretched hand. Then after a brief pause, he clasped it in his own and shook it firmly. There was no mockery, no unnecessary words, just mutual understanding. At that moment, something inside Mike shifted. He had spent years trying to be the strongest man in the room, the guy everyone looked up to, the one who set the standard for toughness. But today he had learned the hardest lesson of all. Real strength wasn't about being the loudest, the most intimidating, the most physically dominant. Real strength was about discipline, humility, and the ability to recognize when you have been beaten, not just by someone else, but by your own ego. The crowd around them began to soften. The tension in the gym dissipating as people saw the unspoken resolution between the two men. There was no longer a battle of dominance. There was no longer a need to prove anything. Vin let go of Mike's hand and gave a slight nod, then turned to grab his gym bag. He slung it over his shoulder, heading toward the exit without another word. But before he reached the door, the gym manager, an older, seasoned lifter who had been watching the entire exchange, called out, "Handled that well." His voice carried through the room, and Vin glanced over his shoulder, giving a faint smile before replying. Just another workout. And then he was gone. The gym remained still for a long moment, everyone absorbing what had just happened. Slowly, people returned to their routines. But the atmosphere had changed. The energy that had once been centered around Mike's dominance was now replaced with something else. Respect for the man who had walked in quietly, done his work, and left without asking for recognition. Mike lingered by the squat rack for a while, staring at the bar Vin had lifted. He could still feel the weight of his own humiliation, but mixed with it was something else. Clarity. He had been so obsessed with proving himself, with tearing others down, that he had never stopped to ask himself why he needed to be the best in the first place. He had let his strength become a weapon, a tool for his own validation, instead of using it for what it was truly meant for. The realization hit hard. The next morning, Mike was back in the gym earlier than usual. There were only a handful of people there, the dedicated lifters who showed up before sunrise. He didn't strut around. He didn't bark orders. He didn't throw sarcastic jabs at the newcomers trying to find their footing. Instead, he walked straight to the punching bag, the same one Vin had decimated the day before, and raised his fists. He threw a punch. It wasn't nearly as powerful. He threw another, still weak. But this time, he didn't feel frustrated. He didn't feel embarrassed. He felt motivated because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't training to prove something to anyone. He was training to be better. Over the next few weeks, things changed. He spent more time listening than talking. He paid attention to his own weaknesses, worked on his form, focused on his growth instead of tearing others down. And the people around him noticed. The ones who had always followed his lead, who had laughed at his taunts, began to realize that the Mike they knew was gone. And maybe, for the first time, they actually respected him for it. Then, one afternoon, just as he was finishing up his routine, the gym doors opened. A familiar figure walked in. Johnny Depp dressed in the same simple hoodie and sweatpants as before. He moved through the gym as he had that first day, quietly, confidently, effortlessly. Mike hesitated for only a moment before making a decision. He walked over, then looked up as Mike approached, his expression unreadable. Mike took a breath, then said the words that had been sitting in his chest since that day. "Thanks." Vin studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good." And that was it. No fanfare, no long speech.